So Martin Luther was German, so he had a difficult start in life. He's from Saxony in Germany, it's a nice place. Ancestors of the English came from there. His father was a miner of some description. He seems to have been quite poor when he was younger, but somewhat wealthier by the time Luther was adolescent. There is some suggestion that he had a bit of a temper on him, and that there's a psychobabble explanation for the Reformation that his dad used to come home and sort of beat him up for no reason, and he would just sort of whimper and cover his head and submit unquestioningly to his father to avoid being thumped, and that this roughly he developed his theory of God out of this experience. But I mean, that's a kind of silly psychobabble explanation for the Reformation, but it's amusing. So he wanted his son to do good for himself. He wanted him to progress in the world. He wanted him to be a lawyer. He sent him to university. Luther in the end ended up becoming an Augustinian friar, not becoming a lawyer. Why he did that, there are sort of legends about this. Now, there's some suggestion that Luther may have massaged or invented out of whole cloth elements of his biography. It's very difficult to tell whether that's true or not. So really, all I can do is give you the standard account, and we'll find out at the general judgment what was true. But the standard account is that during his studies, he was walking home one day during a massive thunderstorm, and he was absolutely terrified he was going to be struck down by lightning and killed. And he swore an oath to Saint Barbara, the patron saint of avoiding being killed in thunderstorms, that he would become a monk and a priest if he was spared. He was spared. And so on this very dubious basis, he entered into a vocation to the religious life and the priesthood. Now, he studied at the University of Wittenberg, and he was influenced by a devotional movement that arose in a context really of this Via Moderna in the late Middle Ages, called the Devotio Moderna, which produced many good fruits. It is the origin of the Imitation of Christ, famous spiritual classic, but it has a strong emphasis on the emotions and on imagination, and is much less cerebral and intellectual than earlier forms of Christian devotion. And it has a slightly anti-intellectual strand in it. You see this even on the first page of The Imitation of Christ, where the author, probably Thomas Kempis, says that what's the point in being able to discourse learnedly on the Trinity if you offend the Trinity by your life, which of course is a quite correct observation of the book, but you can see that it comes from a slightly anti-intellectual trend, and there was a kind of disgust with intellectual questions in this period, partly because of the perpetual unresolved civil war in medieval intellectual life between the Via Antiqua and the Via Moderna, also because the sort of civilizational loss of self-confidence that resulted from the 14th century had caused people to start defaming the Middle Ages and its many great achievements as a dark age, and to look back at the classical pagan world as a sort of norm for many things, architecture, painting, etc., but not least in regard to the writing of Latin. And so therefore there was a disdaining of the kind of precise but boring, plodding, technical Latin of the medieval scholastics in favour of the florid, literary Latin of the ancient Roman pagans. So this also influenced devotional climate, in which there was a turning away from a spirituality rooted in doctrine in favour of piety, as it were, emotionally fed piety. So Luther was raised in that context. He was also an adherent of the Via Moderna, and of a very specific form of the Via Moderna, because the different Vii, the Via Antiqua and the Via Moderna, they had schools within them, scholae. So the Thomists and the Albertines and the Aegidians, they belonged to the Via Antiqua, but then there were other schools of the Via Moderna, and the one that Luther belonged to was the Schola Augustina Moderna. So this was a sort of monstrosity where basically you take the theology of St. Augustine Augustine, who is an extremely realist author to a fault. He's more realist than St. Thomas Aquinas. But you take his theology and then you rip out the metaphysics and you stuff nominalism in instead, like some sort of Frankenstein's monster. And that basically produces Protestantism. Now, and Luther claimed later on that he was consumed with scruples because he was terribly worried that he wasn't performing enough works and that his confessions were not valid because he'd forgotten to mention some minor sin that slipped his mind when he was in the confessional. This may or may not be true, who knows? But he found a solution to this in the radical voluntarism of the Via Moderna. Okay, so he was trained for the priesthood in classical studies and in philosophy. He read scripture and he began lecturing in scripture, but he never actually studied Catholic theology properly, other than in a sort of amateur fashion. And he began to construct for himself his own theology based on the philosophical errors of the Via Moderna. Now, while all this was going on, there was a particularly egregious example of the kind of corruption into which the late medieval church had fallen taking place at the same time. A chap called Albert of Brandenburg, who was a younger son of the Elector of Brandenburg, one of the most powerful princes of Germany, of the Holy Roman Empire, as it then was. He was sent, as many a younger son of an aristocratic family would be in those days, on a clerical career. And he was only 18 years old when he was made a bishop. This is inappropriate. He was made bishop of Magdeburg. And he then managed to, with a series of bribes and skillful use of connections, to have himself made administrator of the Diocese of Halberstadt. And then he decided that at the same time he'd also rather like to be the Archbishop of Mainz. So he's effectively trying to become bishop of 3 different places at the same time when he's in his late teens / early 20s, and has no real interest in these questions at all. He just wants to enjoy the revenues and the bling associated with those offices. Now, as I mentioned, the papacy was extremely corrupt at this time, and so they were very happy to provide dispensations for these appalling abuses. And but they wanted certain administrative charges to be met because of the inconvenience that this would put the poor curial officials to, i.e. enormous bribes. So the problem was that poor old Albert, our hero here, he had already paid out bribes to be made 18-year-old Bishop of Magdeburg and then also administrator of the Diocese of Halberstadt. So he'd run out of money in order to pay the whopping great big bribe to be allowed to be Archbishop of Mainz at the same time. The Archbishop of Mainz was also an elector of the Holy Roman Empire, so it made him very politically powerful as well as being a very senior ecclesiastical position. So what he thought was, as many people like him used to think at that time, the easy solution is simply to pledge the revenues of the Archdiocese of Mainz to go towards the bribes to the curial officials until they've been paid off, and then he can start enjoying them himself. However, it turned out that the previous incumbents of the Archdiocese of Mainz had also had to obtain dubious dispensations from people in Rome and also had to pay bribes. So they'd already pledged the revenues of the diocese way into the future. So and the officials weren't willing to wait that long for their bribes. So he had to find a solution. So he went to go and see the Fugger Banking Corporation of Augsburg to see whether they would lend him the money. And they say, yes, but how are you going to pay it back? Because the revenues are already pledged years ahead. And but the officials in Rome were keen to solve this problem. You know, always want to make things work for the faithful. And so what they did is they suggested, because Pope Julius II, one of these colourful pontiffs, had demolished St. Peter's Basilica because he wanted to build a brand new one with all the best Renaissance artists contributing to the designs. He wanted to raise money to build this new basilica, obviously, and he was going to do that by allowing people to receive indulgences for making donations towards the building of the new St. Peter's. And they said, well, why don't you preach this indulgence in your territory, Albert, and you can send half the money to Rome for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, and you can keep half the money to cover your administrative costs in preaching the indulgence, and that money can then be paid to the Fugger Banking Corporation to pay off the loan, to pay us our administrative charges for allowing you to be bishop of 3 different places at the same time when you're in your early 20s. And it was like, everyone's a winner, isn't that marvellous? So they then got a corrupt Dominican called Tetzel to go round northern Germany trying to flog this indulgence. Of course, this is a blasphemy of the most appalling kind and completely wrong, obviously, an abuse. It's not like the Catholic Church ever taught this was a perfectly legitimate thing to do. He was going around Germany, famously supposed to have said, when the shekel in the bowl rings, then the soul to heaven springs, in order to get you to buy the indulgence. And this greatly annoyed Luther's patron. So Luther's patron was the Duke of Saxony. He had built up a huge relic collection in his castle of lots of different saints, and he was keen for people to come and visit his collection of relics. And it turned out that because he'd obtained indulgences for anyone who came to visit his relics, but the indulgences in those days were generally linked to a particular feast day or something like this. But the problem was he had relics of lots of different saints. So the indulgence he obtained could be obtained by the pilgrims on the 1st of November, the Feast of All Saints, because it was lots and lots of different saints whose relics were there. This whole campaign to get people to come and visit his shrine was being undermined by the fact that Tetzel was going around selling off indulgences, supposedly for the rebuilding of St. Peter's, but really in order to facilitate Albert of Brandenburg's corrupt ecclesiastical career. And so there was a lot of bad feeling about this, and Luther perceived that his moment had come, and that he could launch a critique of the whole business of indulgences in both senses of business, and tie that critique to his new theology, which he had developed through the replacing of St. Augustine's metaphysics with his own Ockhamite metaphysics that he had been pursuing for the first years of his academic and clerical career. So on the 31st of October, 1517, 100 years almost to the day, 10 days short of the election of Martin V, Pope Martin V, who had ended the Great Western Schism, where we had 3 popes at the same time. 100 years of squandered time where we could have reformed the church, but instead people just enjoyed themselves. Luther nailed his 95 Theses critiquing the Church's doctrine of indulgences to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, launching the Reformation.